Give me a little insight for those maybe outside the country or who don't know about your background.
Yeah, well, I was born in England. I became an academic, became a professor of political science. I work mainly on politics, voting, elections, the rise of populism, why people are so fed up with the status quo. And I've also become increasingly fed up with the status quo. And I suppose I'm known mainly in Britain and Europe as being a commentator, probably a challenging voice, provocative voice. I write a Substack, which is one of the biggest in the UK. And I generally annoy all the right people. So
that's an interesting place to start. So what is maybe your most challenging and controversial point that annoys the right people?
Well, I wouldn't say this is a controversial point, given that 80% of people agree with it in certainly Britain and much of Europe, which is, firstly, I'm very skeptical of mass immigration. I think it's a policy disaster that is weakening, not strengthening our economy and societies. I'm very skeptical of the established institutions. I think there are lots of people now, millions of people, who simply don't feel like they have a voice in the national conversation. I'm very comfortable with things like Brexit and the rise of populist parties. I think they are bringing a silver lining into politics. I think they're correcting the system in many ways. So these all put me on, the wrong side of the, or outside of the Overton window, which dominates the mainstream conversation, especially for somebody who works in universities, which, as we know, over the last 60 years have moved sharply to the left. So if you are like me, if you think on balance, actually, you're pretty comfortable with Britain leaving the EU, you think mass immigration is out of control, you're deeply concerned about the direction of Western societies, you're deeply concerned about the rise of radical Islamism, the woke left, the threats to free speech and free expression, that puts you in maybe 1 or 2% on campus. So it's been an interesting 10 years, and I'm sure we'll talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I do want to know, actually, how did that start to feel? And the reason I ask is because a lot of us do these podcasts and we say, oh, bloody woke and bloody this and that, and there's the bravado layer here. But how's it actually impacted your day-to-day life, and what does it feel like?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of turning points for me. The first arrived in 2016 with that big Brexit referendum before Donald Trump's victory in November. And then you could sense something was brewing. And unlike most of the people in the universities, when Britain voted to leave the EU, an organization which I've always felt was insufficiently democratic, it was not a genuine democracy. It was overly bureaucratic, it was quite corrupt. And it's also very inefficient. But when Brits voted for that, I thought, well, okay, let's do Brexit. So that instantly, and the reaction to that, the hostility, the way in which the elites described Brexit voters, much like they described Trump voters later on as the deplorables, bigots, gammons, Karens, the rest of it, I thought that was disgusting. And that began to push me in a political journey. I then watched a number of my friends basically be thrown out of the universities or be harassed and discriminated against because of their politics. Not just people like Jordan Peterson, who was disinvited from Cambridge, but scholars like Noah Carl, who was essentially chased out of Cambridge because students protested that he was looking at controversial areas like intelligence and was a moderate conservative scholar. Kathleen Stock, the philosopher who was gender critical, where she was chased out of Sussex. My good friend Eric Helfman, who was essentially chased out of Birkbeck. And I just watched this intolerance playing out among the very people who claim to be the most tolerant of all. And that too, I think, I don't want to say radicalized me, but certainly made me question many of the assumptions and ideological priors that I had. And so increasingly, as I've moved away from the universities into, let's say, the public realm, the public debate, and I've realized just how many people are so utterly frustrated with this status quo in America, Canada, Britain, Europe. Everybody's crying out for basically brave, courageous voices that will stare down the mob and will explain through the lens of evidence and reason why so many of these policies are completely disastrous. And that's essentially my journey.
There's a theory that students going to university, they need to have that time where they break away from what their parents' views might be. Maybe they get a bit irrational, but do we blame the students, or do we blame the adults who started letting the students have an inordinate amount of power?
I mean, it's a good question. I think within the higher education sector, that there are a couple of things going on. I think the first is, over the last 60 years, all the evidence shows this, universities have swung sharply to the left. I'll give you one example. Here in Britain in the 60s, for every 3 left-wing academics, there was 1 conservative academic.
Wow.
Today, for every 9
That's
left-wing
right,
academics, there is 1 conservative academic. So what's the problem with that? Well, when you have an ideological monoculture like that, where only some beliefs are allowed to dominate campus, that emboldens extremists. It emboldens the radical, the woke left, the social justice left that is going even harder and faster at taking over the university bureaucracy. It encourages discrimination against political minorities like conservatives, gender critical scholars, my friends in history who have said actually the legacy of empire in Britain or American history is more complicated and nuanced than the New York Times or The Guardian might have us believe. So it encourages that discrimination. But most of all, it lets down students. And what's happened is, as the universities have moved sharply to the left, they've also become obsessed with student satisfaction, which is, the perceptions of students on campus. And that's now the overriding metric. Are students having a good time? Not are they having a rigorous, intellectually demanding education, but are they having a good, comfortable time? And if they're not, then the university will essentially fall over itself to do whatever it needs to do to ensure that students come first. So removing controversial speakers, chasing controversial academics off campus, reshaping campus life around the more liberal, progressive values and worldviews of students. So we're letting them down, essentially. And I'm not the only person saying this, obviously. Jonathan Haidt in the United States has made this argument. Jordan Peterson has made this argument. But actually, where I have gone further than others is I actually campaigned here in the UK for laws that would that are essentially now forcing universities to protect and promote free speech.
Ooh.
So we've gone a lot further than some of our counterparts in saying, actually, we no longer trust the universities to reform themselves. We're going to push, and we did push for a new law here in the UK, the Higher Education Free Speech Act. Again, made me very unpopular among my colleagues, but now the universities have a legal requirement to promote and protect free speech on campus. And if you're sacked or you're removed from campus because of your political views, universities can now be heavily fined and sanctioned as a result. Now, I don't like to use the state in this way, but sometimes actually when the institutions won't reform themselves, I think intervention is necessary.
It's making my head swim a bit because I'm thinking we want free speech because of the authoritarian state of universities at the moment. So we have to implement an authoritarian measure to enforce it.
Yeah, I think that's partly right. I mean, but I wouldn't describe it as authoritarian. I would say when you've got institutions that are leaning so strongly in one ideological direction, you do actually have to intervene to try and level the playing field. And because the evidence on just what is happening on campus is so overwhelming in the US and the UK, we have alarmingly large numbers of academics who openly say, they won't have lunch with a Trump voter, they won't have lunch with a Brexit voter, they wouldn't hire an academic to an Ivy League college if they knew that academic had Republican sympathies. In many liberal arts colleges, there are no Republicans. We have to ensure that these universities actually allow for a wide range of views. Because look, there are friends of mine who would say the answer is giving up on the institutions and establishing alternative universities. I'm more nervous about that because I think in the end, what you get are essentially segregation along political lines, and you get these parallel institutions. My view is, no, let's stay and let's fight and let's reform the institutions so they can actually present and promote a wider range of views, and dissenters and unorthodox academics and others can keep their places within those institutions.
That's really interesting because Peter Boghossian's one of those. He wants
Peter's a good friend of mine.
Yeah, me too. And he wants to make his own universities, I think.
I think there's a role for that. What Peter's doing, what the guys at the University of Boston are doing, Neil Ferguson, Eric Kaufman at Buckingham. These are important people making a difference. But I'm not ready to give up on the established institutions. And I'm not just talking about universities and colleges here. I'm talking about legacy media. I'm talking about the cultural institutions, the creative industries, the museums, the galleries. I'm talking about, NPR, BBC, New York Times, whatever. Over the next 10, 20 years, I think we're either going to reform these institutions, or we're going to see, wholesale polarization between liberals and conservatives. Now, I'd rather not see that. I'd rather actually work within those institutions, and even if it means intervening, try and force a better conversation and a better representation of views.
You didn't say how it actually felt for you being pushed to the sidelines. You avoided that, or pushed out by the sort of legacy people or the former colleagues and things.
I think there are two stages. I think when you are in the institutions, and I've talked with many other professors, if I were to say their names now, you would, the viewers would know immediately who they are. I'm talking about top level, global names. And I've talked to them about what they've experienced in universities as well by expressing countercultural views. Some of them will say openly they're, taking medication to go to sleep at night because of the stress and the mental toll. But it comes down to two stages. I think stage one is shock, anxiety, and worry. Nobody likes to be bullied. Nobody likes to be harassed. Nobody likes to face regular pile-ons on social media. Nobody likes to go through the process of character assassination, which is what academics will do to people that they perceive to be opposing or just questioning the new religion on campus, the social justice ideology, the wokeism, whatever your preferred term. Stage two, and only some people get to stage two, is no, to hell with that. I'm actually going to dig in and I'm going to stare these guys down. And I think there are a few people that we can see around the world who got to stage two, and we all know who they are because they're still fighting. They're in the trenches and they've built up ecosystems. They've built up YouTube channels and Substacks and think tanks and non-profits and all the rest of it. And stage two, I think, is where you really get people with courage and resilience. And what my experience, and you might have some thoughts on this yourself, but my experience is that stage one is really, really difficult. But stage two, you realize that when you stand up to the mob, there isn't actually much there. They don't really know what to do with you. They'll try and counsel you, but beyond that, if you survive that, you're basically fine. And other people will come. You will lose friends, but you will make many more friends along the way because people rally around courage and strength. And I think many people, perhaps like many people watching this show, sense how high the stakes are now. And I think they can sense that actually what we are witnessing is a civilizational moment. By that, I mean what we are trying to do is to not just defend, but reassert the values, the traditions, and the ways of life, and the collective memory and the history that essentially is what makes us who we are. And so people can sense now, because of the rise of radical Islamism, the rise of the woke left, because of the collapse of strength and courage among the political class, with the exception of a few, individuals, people can sense that actually if something doesn't start to change in the next few years, then it really will be too late to respond to this civilizational moment that we're in.